In 1970, a 93-year-old man died peacefully in Munich. He had never served a single day in prison. 25 years earlier, that same man had sat on the dock at the Nuremberg trials, alongside Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess. The prosecution spent months presenting evidence that he had designed the financial system that secretly rearmed Adolf Hitler in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, that he had financed 12 billion Reichsmarks of secret military spending, hidden from international observers through a scheme the Nuremberg prosecution described as devised exclusively for armament financing, that he had written directly to Hitler boasting that German rearmament was being funded with the frozen assets of Hitler's own political opponents. The tribunal acquitted him. The Soviet judge dissented. A German court later sentenced him to 8 years of hard labor. That sentence was overturned on appeal. He walked free. His name was Hjalmar Schacht. He was Hitler's banker. The question is not whether he was guilty. The documents answer that plainly. His own words are in the Nuremberg evidence files. His own memoranda to Hitler are in the public record. The methyl bill scheme he designed is documented in the trial transcripts available today at the Yale Avalon Project. The question is how a man whose own words document his role in financing the most destructive war in human history walked out of Nuremberg a free man and spent his final decades advising developing nations on economic policy as though none of it had happened. This is that documented story. The paper trail is open, and it answers the question the acquittal left open completely. To understand how Hjalmar Schacht became indispensable to Adolf Hitler, you first need to understand who Schacht was before Hitler existed as a political force. Because the man Hitler appointed to build his war machine was not a Nazi ideologue. He was the most technically accomplished central banker in the world, a man whose reputation had been built on saving Germany from the most catastrophic currency collapse in modern history. Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht was born on the 22nd of January 1877 in the town of Tingelev in Schleswig, then German territory, now part of Denmark. His father had spent years in the United States and named his son after the American journalist and abolitionist Horace Greeley. The name was an early signal of the specific ambiguity that would define Schacht's entire life, a man whose intellectual formation was cosmopolitan, whose professional reputation was international, and whose choices were consistently national in the worst possible sense. He studied medicine, philology, and political science before taking a degree in economics in 1899. He joined the Dresdner Bank, rose quickly, and by the First World War was serving as financial consultant to the German occupation government in Belgium. By 1916, he was a director of the German National Bank. He was meticulous, cold, technically brilliant, and completely without sentiment about the relationship between financial mechanisms and political outcomes. He understood money the way a surgeon understands anatomy, as a system to be manipulated with precision rather than a moral framework to be respected. His defining moment came in 1923. Germany was in the grip of the worst currency collapse in modern history. By November of that year, $1 American was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. The savings of an entire generation had been incinerated. The Weimar Republic was on the verge of political collapse. The government appointed Schacht as currency commissioner with emergency powers. He worked 18-hour days, barely eating, making telephone calls across every financial institution in Germany and Europe simultaneously. His secretary later described him sitting in a dark office, smoking continuously, making calls, never reading letters, never writing them, just telephoning until the problem was solved. Within weeks, Schacht had introduced the Rentenmark, a new currency backed by a mortgage on all German property, and halted the hyperinflation that had seemed unstoppable. The achievement was so extraordinary that he was immediately appointed president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank and the most powerful financial institution in the country. His international reputation was now unassailable. In 1924, he negotiated the Dawes Plan, the American loan arrangement that stabilized German reparations payments and temporarily restored German economic credibility. The plan was designed by the American banker Charles Dawes, who would receive the Nobel Peace Prize for it, and channeled American private capital into Germany to service its reparations obligations to France and Britain, who then used those payments to service their war debts to America. The entire circuit was dependent on continuous American lending. Schacht understood this structural fragility better than almost any other participant in the negotiations. He knew the Dawes system was a revolving debt mechanism that would collapse the moment American lending stopped, which it did in 1929 when Wall Street crashed and American banks called in their German loans simultaneously. The economic catastrophe that followed, the unemployment, the political radicalization, the collapse of Weimar democracy, was partly the consequence of a reparations architecture that Schacht had helped negotiate and privately considered unsustainable from the beginning. In 1929, he led the German delegation at the Young Plan negotiations in Paris. Central bankers across Europe and America regarded him as a peer. Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, was his close personal friend. The two men corresponded regularly, met at international conferences, and shared a worldview about the proper role of central banking in national economic management. In 1930, Schacht resigned from the Reichsbank in protest at the German government's financial policy. He then did something that would define everything that followed. He read Mein Kampf, and he was converted. Not to anti-Semitism in the vulgar sense. Schacht always maintained that he found the racial ideology distasteful, but to the core of what Hitler was promising. The restoration of German national greatness, the reversal of Versailles, the rebuilding of German power. Schacht had spent his entire career watching Germany be humiliated by the financial architecture that the Allied powers had imposed after the First World War. He had personally negotiated the reparation schedules that he considered unjust. He had watched the Weimar Republic fail to generate the political will to resist the terms imposed on it. Hitler was offering something different: the will, the ruthlessness, and the popular mandate to tear up the humiliation entirely. Schacht decided to help. In November of 1932, Schacht and the industrialist Wilhelm Kepler organized a petition of Germany's most powerful financial and industrial leaders, a document signed by 38 bankers, landowners, and corporate heads, requesting President Paul von Hindenburg to appoint Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The petition was a decisive intervention. Hindenburg was resistant. The petition from Germany's financial establishment gave him the reassurance he needed that Hitler's appointment would not produce economic chaos. On the 30th of January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor. The financial establishment had helped put him there. Schacht had helped organize the financial establishment. If you have not subscribed to the channel yet, please do it now. This is exactly the kind of financial history we cover, the documented mechanisms behind the events that shape the modern world. Every subscriber genuinely matters to what we are building here. Hold that sequence for a moment. A man who had saved Germany from economic catastrophe, built an international reputation as the most technically gifted central banker of his era, befriended the governor of the Bank of England, and negotiated with the American financial establishment, using every instrument of his professional credibility to help place Adolf Hitler in the German chancellery. Because what happened next? The specific financial mechanism that Schacht designed in the years between 1933 and 1937 is the part of the story that the standard account of Nazi Germany reduces to the phrase German economic recovery without examining how that recovery was actually engineered, what it was actually financing, and what its designers actually knew they were building toward. When Hitler took power in January 1933, Germany faced a structural problem that no amount of political will could resolve through conventional means. The Versailles Treaty had banned German rearmament. International observers were monitoring German compliance. Germany's foreign exchange reserves were essentially exhausted. Its government debt was at levels that made conventional borrowing impossible without triggering the scrutiny of international creditors. And the rearmament program Hitler intended to execute, the program that would restore German military power to a level capable of challenging France and Britain simultaneously, would cost sums that dwarfed anything Germany could raise through taxation or open borrowing. Schacht was reappointed president of the Reichsbank on the 17th of March 1933. Within months he had designed the solution. It was called the Mifo bill system, and it was, by any technical measure, a masterpiece of financial engineering in service of catastrophe. The mechanism began with a shell company. Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, the Metallurgical Research Corporation, was established with a nominal capital of 1 million Reichsmarks. It had no employees, no research program, no actual business activity of any kind. It existed solely as a legal entity whose name could appear on financial instruments. Those instruments were the Mefo bills. When an arms manufacturer, Krupp, Rheinmetall, Siemens, Junkers, Blohm & Voss, produced military equipment for the German government, the government did not pay them directly from the state budget. Instead, the manufacturer received ME-Fo bills, short-term financial notes guaranteed by the Reichsbank and ostensibly issued by the Metallurgical Research Corporation. The manufacturer could then take those bills to a private German bank, which would exchange them for cash, confident that the Reichsbank had guaranteed their value. The private bank could then present the Mefo bills to the Reichsbank itself, which would honor them by issuing new currency. The critical feature of the system was what it concealed. Because the transactions flowed through a private shell company rather than directly through the government budget, the rearmament spending did not appear in Germany's official fiscal accounts. International observers examining German government finances saw nothing unusual. The arms manufacturers were paid. The military was rearmed, and the financing mechanism that made it possible was invisible to anyone not inside the Reichsbank itself. Alongside the MEFO system, Schacht introduced what he called the New Plan in September 1934, a comprehensive system of bilateral trade agreements that allowed Germany to acquire raw materials from foreign suppliers without spending the foreign exchange it did not have. Under the New Plan, Germany negotiated barter arrangements with countries in South America, Southeastern Europe, and the Middle East, exchanging German-manufactured goods for the iron ore, copper, oil, and other raw materials that its arms industry required. The system effectively insulated German rearmament from the foreign exchange constraints that would otherwise have made it impossible. The arms manufacturers were paid in MEFO bills, the raw material suppliers were paid in goods, the Reichsbank issued currency to cover the bills, and Germany rearmed in secret while the international financial system saw nothing that alarmed it. Schacht ran this system from 1933 to 1938. By the time it wound down, the MEFO bills had financed approximately 12 billion Reichsmarks of military spending, roughly equivalent to $42 billion today. The German army had grown from 100,000 men to over 500,000. The Luftwaffe had been created from nothing. The Kriegsmarine had launched the first of the warships that would contest the North Atlantic. The industrial capacity to manufacture tanks, aircraft, artillery, and submarines at war production scale had been established. All of it financed through a shell company with a capital of 1 million Reichsmarks. The Nuremberg prosecution's assessment of the MEFO system was unambiguous. The scheme was devised for the exclusive use of armament financing. The bills were guaranteed by the Reichsbank and backed in effect by nothing more than its position as a bank of issue. Schacht's own memorandum to Hitler, dated the 3rd of May 1935, stated that the Reichsbank had invested the major part of Reichsbank accounts owned by foreigners. The frozen assets of foreign nationals and political opponents held in German accounts directly into armament drafts. His exact words to Hitler, "Our armaments are therefore being financed partially with the assets of our political opponents." This was not a man who did not know what he was building. This was a man who wrote to his head of state to boast about it. This is the kind of documented financial history that the standard account almost never tells you directly. If this channel is new to you, please subscribe now. We cover the paper trail behind the official version of events, so we now have the complete picture of the mechanism. A shell company with 1 million Reichsmarks in capital, issuing financial instruments that financed 12 billion Reichsmarks of secret military spending. An arms industry paid in paper backed by nothing but the Reichsbank's promise. A government budget that showed none of it. International observers who saw nothing because there was nothing to see in the official accounts. And a Reichsbank president who wrote personally to Adolf Hitler boasting that the rearmament of Germany was being financed with the frozen assets of Hitler's political opponents. Because the question the mechanism now forces us to examine is not what Schacht built. The documents answer that completely. The question is how it ended. When the system collapsed under its own weight, what Schacht did next, and how a man who left those documents in the public record managed to walk out of Nuremberg acquitted. By 1937, the MEFO system was approaching its structural limits. The bills were designed as 5-year instruments. The first ones issued in 1933 would begin maturing in 1938. When they matured, the Reichsbank would be required to honor them, which meant printing new currency on a scale that risked precisely the hyperinflation that Schacht had spent his career preventing. He had built a financial bomb and set it on a 5-year timer. Schacht's response was to begin distancing himself from the program he had designed. He wrote a series of memoranda to Hitler in 1936 and 1937 warning that the pace of rearmament was pushing Germany toward financial crisis. He argued that the foreign exchange deficit was becoming unsustainable. He clashed with Hermann Göring, who had been appointed plenipotentiary of the 4-year plan in October 1936, effectively placing him above Schacht in the economic hierarchy over the pace of military spending. In November 1937, Schacht resigned as Minister of Economics. Hitler retained him as minister without portfolio and as Reichsbank president, unwilling to allow the international financial community to read his departure as a signal of German economic instability. In January 1939, Hitler finally dismissed Schacht from the Reichsbank presidency. The official reason was a memorandum Schacht had submitted warning that continued deficit spending would produce inflation. The real reason was that Schacht had become a liability, a man whose private reservations about the pace of rearmament were creating friction at precisely the moment when Hitler was preparing to use the war machine Schacht had financed. What happened next is the part of Schacht's story that his post-war defenders used most extensively to argue for his acquittal. After his dismissal from the Reichsbank, Schacht made contact with elements of the German resistance. He was approached by members of the conspiracy that eventually produced the July 20th bomb plot of 1944. He was arrested after the plot's failure and sent to a succession of concentration camps, Ravensbrück, Flossenbürg, and finally Dachau, where Allied forces found him alive in April 1945. This personal history served Schacht's defense at Nuremberg with remarkable effectiveness. A man who had been imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps could present himself as a victim of the regime rather than one of its principal architects. The fact that he had spent the years 1933 to 1938 designing the financial system that made Hitler's war possible was reframed as the actions of a patriotic German economist doing his job within the constraints of his time. His subsequent resistance activities, limited and cautious as the documented record shows them to have been, became the centerpiece of a defense that the majority of the Nuremberg tribunal found sufficiently convincing to acquit. The Soviet judge Iona Nikitchenko disagreed. His dissent from the acquittal is one of the most pointed documents in the entire Nuremberg record. Nikitchenko argued that the evidence of Schacht's role in financing German rearmament was overwhelming, and that the defense of subsequent disillusionment could not legally negate the documented consequences of the action Schacht had personally designed and executed. The majority overruled him. Schacht walked out of the Nuremberg courthouse a free man. The Nuremberg acquittal of Hjalmar Schacht is one of the most studied and most contested decisions in the history of international law. The tribunal's reasoning rested on a specific legal distinction that financing rearmament was not in itself a crime under the charter that governed the Nuremberg proceedings. The charter defined crimes against peace as the planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of wars of aggression. The prosecution argued that financing the military capacity that made those wars possible was an indispensable component of their preparation. The tribunal majority concluded that the causal chain between Schacht's financial engineering and the specific decisions to wage aggressive war was insufficiently direct for criminal conviction. 3 of the 4 judges voted to acquit. The 4th, the Soviet judge Iona Nikitchenko, dissented with a force that the majority did not adequately address. Nikitchenko had been one of the principal architects of the Nuremberg framework itself. He understood the charter's provisions as well as any participant in the proceedings. His dissent argued that the evidence of Schacht's active and knowing participation in the rearmament program was not in dispute. Schacht's own documents proved it, and that the defense of subsequent disillusionment and resistance activity could not legally extinguish criminal responsibility for the original acts. The majority's acquittal, Nikitchenko wrote, was not consistent with the evidence presented at the trial. The documents that the tribunal examined, and that remain available to any researcher today, tell a more complete story than the acquittal acknowledged. Schacht's own memorandum of the 3rd of May 1935 to Hitler stated explicitly that the Reichsbank had invested foreign held accounts into armament drafts. He was not a passive technician executing orders. He was an active participant boasting to his head of state about the specific ingenuity of the financing mechanism he had designed. The Nuremberg prosecution's own summary of the MEFO evidence stated that the scheme was designed to meet 2 objectives simultaneously: raising funds above what taxation and public loans could provide, and concealing the rearmament program from international observers. Both objectives were deliberate. Both were Schacht's design. The concealment was not incidental to the system, it was its central purpose. The Industrielleningabei, the petition Schacht had organized in 1932 to place Hitler in the chancellery, documented his role in creating the political conditions for everything that followed. Without the reassurance of Germany's financial establishment, the Hindenburg appointment might not have occurred. Schacht knew this. His post-war memoirs acknowledged it. What the tribunal's legal framework could not accommodate was moral responsibility that preceded the specific acts of aggression it was designed to prosecute. Schacht's most consequential decisions were made between 1932 and 1937, years before the invasions of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland that constituted the crimes against peace. By the time Germany crossed the Polish border in September 1939, Schacht had already resigned, had already been building his distance from the regime, and had already begun constructing the narrative of reluctant compliance that would eventually secure his acquittal. The German denazification tribunal that subsequently convicted him, sentencing him to 8 years of hard labor as a major offender, took a less charitable view of this timeline. That conviction was also overturned on appeal. Schacht was released in September 1948. He immediately formed his own private bank in Dusseldorf. In the following years, he worked as a financial consultant to governments in Egypt under Nasser, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Iran. He wrote his memoirs. He gave interviews in which he presented himself as a German patriot who had tried to moderate Hitler's excesses from within. He maintained until his death that he had served Germany, not National Socialism, and that his financial engineering had been the action of a professional doing his duty rather than an ideologue pursuing a program. The international financial community largely accepted this account. Montague Norman, his Bank of England friend, had died in 1950 without ever being required to explain his own role in the financial relationships between London and Berlin during the rearmament years. The broader network of international bankers who had maintained relationships with the German financial establishment throughout the 1930s faced no comparable reckoning. Schacht's acquittal was, in some sense, the acquittal of an entire system of financial relationships that preferred not to examine what its products had financed. The Nuremberg trial transcripts are at the Yale Avalon Project. Schacht's memorandum to Hitler of the 3rd of May 1935 is in the evidence files. The paper trail has been open for 80 years. If this is the kind of forensic financial history you have been looking for, please subscribe to the channel. And if this video changed how you think about who was really responsible for the Second World War, share it with someone who still believes the bankers who financed it were just doing their jobs. Leave a $sign in the comments if you made it to the end. I will see you in the next one.